At 2,000 meters high, it can be cold. Very cold. In June 1956, it was known that up there, on Monte Bondone, cyclists would have to face a test of resistance. But no one expected that the mercury bar could dramatically fall below zero. While a storm of snow and ice turned the streets into a white hell. That was beyond any possible stretch of the imagination. June 8th, 1956 was a day that was almost unbelievable. The account of the cyclists who lived through it leaves you speechless to this day, decades later. And Monte Bondone, the third to last stage of the 1956 Giro d'Italia, was simply named the tragedy, luckily avoided, by the press of the time. A story to be told on the pages of the following day's newspapers. Then, it entered the history books of cycling as an epic feat of the Angel of the Mountain. That's right, because more than the cold, the real star of that day was him, Charlie Gaul. The mountain has a simple rule. If you want to go further, you can't go around it. You have to get to the top. This is in Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs. Produced by Dogge in association with Agenzia ICE for an appreciation of the best that Made in Italy has to offer. Episode 7, Monte Bondone, an unforgettably cold day. Charlie Gaul had elegant features, light eyes, and a look fit for a leading actor in some Hollywood movie of his time. He was a perfect representative of his home country, Luxembourg, a small kingdom wedged between France and Germany with a very strong cycling tradition. Already at his first World Championships in 1954, the 22-year-old Gaul showed that he had a particular skill in climbs, managing to keep up with none other than the champion Coppi and returning home with a well-deserved bronze. He reaffirmed that at the following year's Tour, when after a bad start he recovered just when the road started to go up. On the mountains, where many others slow down, he gives his best and catches up with others in the general standings. He who rode as if the force of gravity had no effect on him, he who seemed subject to other laws of physics. This is how the legend of the Angel of the Mountain was established. An angel, as if there was something inhuman about that blue-eyed boy pedaling straight to the finish line. His legend was fully founded after his face-off with Bondone on that day in June 1956. Nobody thought that 21st stage of the Giro could turn out to be smooth and simple. The departure was in Merano, towards Monte Bondone, in western Trentino. It was the third to last day. The riders had already raced for several kilometers, yet a considerable test awaited them, with 5 important climbs. Costalunga, Rolle, Gobbera, Broccon, and finally, Bondone. A total of 242 kilometers between asphalt and dirt roads. They were almost at the end, yet the Giro could still change drastically. and no one was under the illusion that it was over. Alessandro Fantini did well in the first few days, at the peak of his career right then. Coppi was also in the race, but an unexpected event stopped him at Rimini. The champion fell and got up with a fractured vertebra, one of the numerous accidents that punctuated his career. He couldn't continue racing, and the Giro lost one of its main characters. Fate also fell upon Magni, who after 2 crashes chose not to retire anyway, and instead ran the rest of the Giro as best he could, bandaged and in pain. When the Milanese goal was finally getting closer, you still couldn't tell who'd win that edition. Above all, Fantini and Fornara won the Maglia Rosa. After Sondrio Merano of June 7th, Charlie Gaul was 24th. And then came June the 8th, 1956. They set off from Priti Merano in South Tyrol. They were a few hundred meters above sea level, at the foot of the Alps, and summer was about to start. Although it was still cold, it drizzled. It had been sunny on the Stelvio, but here the weather was very different. German experts who monitored the area had mentioned the possibility of a disturbance. Photos from the time show the fans on the streets of Merano under umbrellas, wrapped up in overcoats and raincoats, and damp asphalt shiny with rain. It was one of those days when climbing high in the mountains would have been the last thing on your mind, let alone on a bicycle. On the Costa Lunga, it turned out that the meteorologists were right. Those experts in the discipline that was still young at the time and subject to inaccuracies. Temperatures plummeted, and the rain turned into sleet, and the shadow of disaster began to stretch over the road. Then it got worse. The sleet became snow. Then along came a storm. The road conditions were prohibitive, with a visibility of a few tens of meters. Before the eyes of the cyclists, there was a whitewashed road, and the asphalt was eaten by the snow, treacherous and slippery. And if they raised their eyes from the ground, they would continue to see the whiteness of the low clouds and the swirling snowflakes. A storm in the high mountains is always dangerous. But on a bike, lashed by the cold, without even the right clothing, it can become a tragedy. While the first riders gave up, getting off their bikes and seeking shelter in the cars that followed, more or less forcibly deciding to retire, Gaul launched his first attack against the first, the GPM. That's right, to him the cold is an ally. Unlike other peers who suffered from the coldest temperatures, some champions, on the contrary, give their best in the sun. The blue-eyed boy from Luxembourg is comfortable on the mountains, not only because of the slope, but also because of the weather. He knew it, and in the first climbs, he saw an opportunity to seize. "I know what cold is. I'm from Luxembourg," he once told a reporter. Sure, but it's hard to say if he knew exactly what kind of hell would await him that day. That wasn't just cold, it was a true apocalypse on Bondone. If facing Costa Lunga was tough, what came next was even worse. The geography of the mountain was as ruthless as its climate. After the top came the descents, made very insidious by the mud on the ground and by the persistent sleet, with an icy wind that could freeze you, lashing violently. Cyclists got there soaked by the rain from Merano and whitened by the snow from the Costa Lunga, their sweat turning to ice on their skin. It was cold, a cold never felt before. This is how Aldo Moser would describe it. 22 years old at the time and third in the standings, he was there that day and stayed on the saddle until the end. Then the ascent to Rolle began, and from the low clouds, hail began to fall. Others among those who'd held out until then, decided to give up. Many were picked up on the street by the organizers' cars, frozen, destroyed, with numb hands unable to hold the handlebars. Some were given some time to warm up and recover the sensitivity in their fingers before getting back on the bike. It wasn't in the regulation, but it didn't matter anymore. It was survival. The racers were permitted, if not recommended, to find temporary shelter in the huts. Some then resumed the race. Most didn't. Many would cross the finish line like that, by car. For those who were still on the road, a test of resistance that's difficult even to imagine began. They had to climb the Bondone. They had the slope to fight against, and there was an icy wind, the snow that covered everything, falling from the sky and gathering on the road. Those who stood on the sidelines enduring the storm knew by now that they were no longer just spectators. Those who were there would lend help. They approached the cyclists, pushed them forward, gave them jackets and blankets. In some cases, they literally saved them from freezing. Sometimes the riders had to get off their bikes and lift them to go past icy white mounds blocking the road and getting up to their knees. The photos of the time portray them as focused, with their bikes in their hands. Bikes that at the time weighed much more than today, by the way. Their hands, often bare, were exposed to the elements. Their gloves were racing gloves, fingerless, and certainly not made of wool. Aldo Mose would lament having no sensitivity in his fingertips for days and days after the race when it was over, and it would take him weeks to recover. He also raced with the wrong shoes, because a few stages from the end, he'd had his spare pairs stolen, but the ones he should have been wearing also disappeared by mistake. Aldo Mose, Francesco's brother, climbed the stormy Bondone like this, with his bare hands and with a pair of shoes that were too big, borrowed from a team follower. There were those who proposed to stop the race, while the cyclists continued to stop, exhausted, decimated by the frost. They cried out for help, seeking shelter from the storm, numb, bordering on freezing. Some fell, the fault of the wheels that couldn't hold on the asphalt. Some were providentially saved by the cars of the journalists and organizers. They set off in t-shirts and shorts. They were neither equipped nor prepared for what they found up there on Bondone. Those who lived through that day say that one could only improvise, covering themselves up with what was available, putting on layers of clothes by tucking shirts and capes over other shirts. They got some things from those people up there watching the race, and even used newspapers in an attempt to warm themselves up. They fought against the cold, no longer to finish first. Those who arrived on Bondone had to resist enough to take the descent and return to the valley. There was no escape, there was no other way out. They were alone up the climbing paths where the cars struggled to reach, and then racing down those descents, which were even worse because without the warmth of pedaling, only the cold remained. The organizers and many others were busy helping those in need, or at least they tried as much as possible. 1956. These were years in which cell phones didn't exist yet, and thus communicating with the runners scattered throughout the mountain was impossible. Once the race had started, you could only help those in need to avoid the worst. But road conditions were a serious problem. In Vanese, the snow reached 8 inches, double that for Vazon. It was snowing on the dirt road. The cars had to stop, blocked by snow. Their tires slipped and skidded. Those who continued the race by bike risked finding themselves alone in the cold, with no one there to help. Even the journalists, cars and motorbikes were left behind after having shuttled between troubled cyclists. They could no longer know where the bikes were, who needed to be picked up and brought to safety. Pasquale Fornara, with 4 Tours de Suisse on his CV and wearing the Maglia Rosa from that day, gave in to the insistence of his sporting director, who had the race in mind, but also saw the day for what it was. He insisted and convinced him to give up. Fornara stopped in a makeshift hut where he found refreshment and only came out several hours later. He wasn't the only one. The chronicles report of others who followed his example, stopping in search of blankets, a fire to warm up, a glass of grappa to recover. It wasn't easy. Amidst all that defeat, however, some were continuing to pedal. Alone on the mountain, facing nature that was showing them its worst face, its cruelest face. There was a group of athletes who endured and were ahead of everyone. Him, Charlie Gaul. He continued and went up Bondone, struggling with the snow and the fatigue, and also struggling to stay within the tracks left by the tires of the cars that passed before him, on what was once just a mule track, because the wheels couldn't go on the snow. Supporters standing by the side of the road shouted his name. He didn't seem to listen to them, focused, with a lost look, ride, to the end. What he did wasn't human. He emerged from the mist, through the low clouds, among the snowstorm. Charlie Gaul arrived at Vazon del Bondone at 1,654 meters, with snow-capped peaks in the background, literally minutes away from freezing. He said nothing and crossed the finish line in silence. Those that were up there surrounded him, wrapped him in a blanket. He was exhausted with frozen tears, staring straight ahead. Gaul didn't have the strength to cheer, let alone the strength to ask for help. He didn't seem to understand what had happened. After all that, after going for kilometers, his legs couldn't take it anymore. They had to support him and pull him off the bike with their arms. 2 men in uniform took care of it, holding him by the legs. They were wrapped in long coats, a stark contrast to the Belgian shorts. He slipped his arms around their shoulders, his head down, looking confused. Next to him was his incredulous mechanic. Gaul won the stage in those extreme conditions, on a mountain that would be very tough, even in a normal race. And there, he made up for approximately 17 minutes in the standings. But all of that didn't count at that moment. Disbelief. That's the feeling that best describes those moments after the arrival of Gaul. They had to cut his shirt with a knife. It was so cold that there was no other way to get it off him. It's said that Gaul only asked for a hot bath. Just that. They obliged, of course. They took him to one of the closest cabins and immersed him in boiling water to help him recover. It would take hours for the champion to come to his senses and understand the extent of what he'd done. Meanwhile, the others arrived. Alessandro Fantini finished second, Agostino Coletto and Pierino Baffi finished 4th and 5th, and in 3rd place, Fiorenzo Magni. Magni, the Lion of Flanders, the 3rd man after Bartali and Coppi with an important career, condemned, however, to remain in the shadow of the champions. He was used to complicated situations. He'd won the 1948 Giro amidst endless controversies, because he'd won one stage only after his beloved Bartali had fallen to the ground, and had received help from the fans, who cheered him on. He'd been penalised by the judges, but it still seemed not harsh enough to Bartali and to the public. He'd won the Giro that year, but not the hearts of the enthusiasts, who only changed their mind about his ontology the following year at the Tour of Flanders. In 1949, Magni was the Italian who triumphed after coming to the race alone, without a team, and highly prepared. His compatriots appreciated it. And when he raced back home, he found the support that was lacking in 1948. He won in 51 and 55, becoming the oldest winner of the Maglia Rosa. He remains the third man, the one who comes after Coppi and Bartali. But he'd only say good things about them, even when the two cycling champions ended up diverting attention from a respectable career. Ironically, that's his fate in 56 as well. His story would probably have received more attention had it not been overshadowed by Gaul's feat. A story that is epic, and that says a lot about the cyclist's temper in that particular year at his last Giro d'Italia, the last of his career. And Magni was not ready to stop, despite everything that happened. That's right, fate seemed to be relentless on him. A first accident happened on a descent in Volterra, where he fell. He ended up in the hospital, where he was diagnosed with a broken collarbone. They wrapped it up and he reassured the doctor the next day would be a day of rest, to give himself time to get back in shape. He rested for a day and then decided to continue, also because the next stages were in areas he knew well. He tried, suffering through and continuing his last Giro. He literally gritted his teeth, didn't give up. But after arriving at Bologna-San Luca, he couldn't handle the pain. He covered the handlebars with foam to cushion the bumps, but it still wasn't enough. Then his mechanic had an idea. He cut an air chamber and tied it to the handlebar. He bit down on it in the uphill time trial towards the sanctuary of San Luca to bear the pain. So he pedaled between the crowd on both sides, who encouraged him, applauded, and got excited. No, he was not willing to stop. He wanted to run the last lap to the end. And then it happened again. Another accident on the road to Rapallo. Just before the climbs, he hit a hole and found himself on the ground again. He fell on the fracture and the pain was so much that he passed out. He was rescued by his fellow racers, who lifted him off the ground, then they loaded him on their shoulders and put him in an ambulance. But then he woke up, and the ambulance stopped. "I'm not retiring," said Magni, getting off. He also added a "for God's sake." He returned to the street, where the group waited for him. He got back on track and somehow got to the end. He was determined to race his last Giro to the very end. He continued pedaling towards Lecco, Sondrio, Bormio, Merano. His shoulder hurt, and yet he kept pedaling. Bondone and then beyond, in the last stages up to Milan. Fiorenzo Magni comes second, 3 minutes and a little more from the Angel of the Mountain. Second, with a broken collarbone and humerus. He discovered those fractures only at the end of the stage. He was plastered by a doctor who was amazed to find out what the patient had done. Magni's plaster would be removed by a trusted mechanic in the workshop with sheet metal scissors to prepare for the last races of the season. In addition to the memories of those who experienced it firsthand and the photos of the time, the sheer numbers give an idea of what a day that was. Beyond temperatures that fell below zero, there were 41 people who arrived exhausted at the finish line, less than half of the 86 who started. Incredulous, distraught, bordering on fainting, many suffering from the first symptoms of frostbite. A disturbing stage, they would call it. The apocalypse on Bondone. 2 days later in Milan, Gaul became the winner of that edition. But it's thanks to his feat on Bondone that the boy from Luxembourg won the affection and sympathy of the Italian public. He became an idol, a legend, He was called the Angel of the Mountain by those chroniclers who were always looking for evocative names. He'd returned to the Giro with yet another feat, albeit less extreme than Bondone. In 1959, he amazed us on the Aosta Courmayeur between Piccolo and Gran San Bernardo. He also returned to Bondone in 1960, retracing that very climb. And who knows what the reserved and silent boy from Luxembourg felt deep inside. The snow became the main character yet again, luckily without bordering on tragedies like on Bondone, but it still happened. 1988, Chiesa in Valmalenco Bormio, on the Gavia Cima Coppi of that year, a storm unleashed itself. Expectations were high. After all, by now Bondone had something mythical about it, and the race didn't stop. The snowplows took care of clearing the asphalt. The temperature dropped to -4, and Chioccioli, who wore the maglia rosa, gave in to the cold. Just like in 1956, some got off their bikes and stopped, and the cars struggled to move forward in the snow. Some continued on foot. The American Andy Hempston and the Dutchman Johan van der Velde remained in the race. This time, both the cyclists and their teams were prepared, even for the worst. Of course, the storm that broke was violent. In theory, they were well equipped, especially the Americans. The two arrived in Bormio. Johan van der Velde came first, wearing a t-shirt because he'd lost his plastic poncho. Up there, at the top, the conditions were prohibitive. They were thinking about whether they should continue, or if maybe it'd be better to stop the race. Van der Velde had no doubt. He continued pedaling, resolute, heading towards Bormio. Between them and the end of the stage, there was an unforgiving descent, and that's where the Dutchman stopped. Covered in snow, surrounded by people wearing thermal suits, he fell back by 47 minutes from the American. It wasn't a bike ride anymore, Hamston would say, referring to many things. There was snow on the ground, ice, the brakes no longer worked as they should, the fans and onlookers advanced on the street, astonished. Some even had shovels in hand to help clear the snow from the road. The cars remained stuck behind. An indescribable cold, a test of endurance for body and mind. But Bondone, Gaul, and that infernal cold day are still legendary. Many have written about it, certainly all the great journalists of the time. Bondone has shown the violence of nature and the willpower of man, pushing the sport to the limit. The exhausted Gaul and his lost expression are symbolic of a hero who made it. He, a reserved runner and of few words, at that moment seemed both invincible and vulnerable, a hero and a man. In Cima, the greatest Giro d'Italia climbs, is a Giro d'Italia podcast produced by Dog Ear, starring Daniel Tanner, executive producer Marta Donà and Carlo Lenotti. Written by Valentina Camarini, with the editorial support of Giacomo Botto. Directed by Marco Ferrarini. Producer Irene Oriani. Sound design and original music by Pasquale Lo Savio. Recording Dario Cuomo. Artwork Andrea Lodetti. English adaptation Diego Ferrarini. Special thanks to Silvia Forestieri, Eva Visentin and Simone Pozzi.
Una produzione Dog Ear.